Welcome back to 50 Days to Rebuild Week 2. This is the series where I read through 50 pages of a physio book and do 50 minutes of exercise a day in an effort to try and rehab myself. This is day 8. As always, starting off with the exercise portion of the challenge. So looking at the bird dog. So I had continual success following on from yesterday, just trying to externally rotate at the shoulders and then try and push my shoulders around the body and through. This seemed to work a lot better than trying to isolate everything into these little joint movements. So I'm really happy that that was working and it's not aggravating my shoulder anymore. Now I tried to transition this over into bench pressing. As you'll see, I'm not using any weight, I'm just using a dowel. Basically the idea is, as I was discussing in the previous video, I'm trying to keep the serratus engaged the whole time. I was having some difficulty with this, and then I rewatched an MSK neurology video. If you haven't heard of him, I think it's just a fantastic channel. I really admire him and his approach. I think it is something that runs counter to a lot of what I've heard, but it also mirrors a lot of what I've thought through when it comes to the body. For example, he talks about not coming down and back when doing a lot of exercises like a bench, which is like a very common cue. This is something that I sort of thought through prior to encountering his content, that I was very sketchy on that idea that that was even possible. And he basically says, you shouldn't do it because you'll compress certain nerves, it's not great. So sort of took him on his word for that, and I guess tried to sort of apply that into the bench, and it started getting a bit better, but still not perfect. Toward that lower portion, I was like, how can I keep my serratus on? And then realized I wasn't following his other cue, which was, he kind of called it elbows out, which is a classic fault of a bench press, but it's not quite that. It was more like a lat spread or a back spread. And the thing is here, he's really just engaging upward rotation, just a little bit. And what was incredible about that was that he kind of touched on it, and it's that when you're downwardly rotated, your shoulders roll forward. And I don't feel like I've ever heard anybody mention that before, but I have scapular winging, as I've seen. It comes in medially, which means my shoulders are downwardly rotated, and I've struggled for a very long time to activate my serratus. What does that tell me? Well, it's not necessarily that I have like a nerve damage and I can't activate my serratus because of that. Maybe it's positionally inhibited and it's straight up impossible because I've blocked it. That the scapula can't tilt because it's getting jammed into the rib cage at the inferior angle. So I did try and apply this, and it's hard to sort of get the right level of rotation. It was just slight, and it's that feeling of, I'm spreading my back and sort of my armpit. And I get that that's sort of a hard point, and even I wasn't 100% sure of is this the absolute right position? But doing that and trying to keep the posterior tilt and serratus activation felt much better. It wasn't perfect by any means. I'm still struggling with the other parts of the move, right? Like the grip, trying to keep my forearms as vertical as possible. I'm not quite understanding that, because I guess vertical as possible doesn't mean completely vertical, because I don't imagine there's any way for that to happen during lockout. Unless we had like a pure triceps type of dip, and I don't think that could happen if we have upwards rotation, and I do genuinely think this upwards rotation is important, so that's okay. I'm just trying to figure that out. I was getting some lateral elbow, barely pain, just like weird twinging. I think this sort of suggests to me hey, this scapular movement you're trying to cue is right, but your serratus isn't there yet for what you're trying to do. So coming back to something like that serratus wall slide, I'm a little scared of doing that. My shoulder was actually quite painful the day after doing it, but maybe that's something we have to come back to and really just focus on this new type of cueing. Also, just really exciting, this dowel exercise. If you've seen any of the previous videos, you might notice that I'm externally rotating when I do it. And this is because just an exercise physio I just happened to meet sort of said, yeah, you can bulletproof your shoulders, trying to do the full over the head in both directions. And it kind of was basically you could internally rotate or externally rotate when doing this. And I wasn't too sure about how I felt about that, because when I read Becoming a Supple Leopard, he talks about the laws of torque. Oh, this is Kelly Starrett. And he basically says, yeah, when your arms become behind your body, it should internally rotate. If they come forward, it should externally rotate. And the only difference is if your elbows are bent and it comes behind your body, you should still externally rotate. Well, my arms are straight, I'm coming behind my body. And I'm thinking about the fact that there's this sketchy range I've been experiencing when I normally do this. I've been a bit scared to experiment with internal rotation here. I feel like internal rotation is something that's been vilified for me, as well as anterior scapular tilt. I might add, in the same bench press video from MSK Neurology, he says, anterior scapular tilt is what happens when your arm comes behind your body. And I think this is sort of the revelation I had with the dowel exercise in general, which is just prioritize retraction and like stuff it, let the scapular tilt do what it's going to do. So doing internal rotation with this retraction, I got great range. I could feel how that mimics, say, something like a German hang. And I just think that's really cool. It didn't hurt at all. There was no sketchiness. There was maybe at one point when I wasn't quite getting the downward rotation I wanted with it, because I was trying to combine that. But overall, I think that was great. Moving on to what I learned, still on Your Spine, Your Yoga, and much like yesterday, coming to something about Stuart McGill. It's a bit odd because that's not who the author is, this is Bernie Clark, but the author is essentially saying that there used to be this data that said that gymnasts, who I used to be one when I was a little kid, they have much higher prevalences of spondylolisthesis, so a slipping of the vertebra on top of another, which I also have. But the new data shows that that's not actually the case. It sort of mimics the normal population. And this is something that I find quite interesting because it was some of the epidemiological data that McGill used to justify flexion extension ranges causing spondy, and basically that we shouldn't have movement through the spine. Again, I don't think he's wrong, but I'm very intrigued in this idea of movement versus stability of the spine, and this was just an interesting little add on to that. I will say overall, having read the 50 pages today, I'm kind of disappointed by this book. I thought it would be more stretch heavy, like, hey, here's the pose we do, here's some cues to run through to apply to your own individual body. Instead, this honestly feels like it would be an awesome book to start with if you wanted to learn anatomy. That's great if that's what you want to do. I've learned a lot of anatomy. This would have made reading a lot of the books I've read a lot easier. I think the author is doing a great job of explaining a lot of the terms, but I'm quite familiar with them already, so it does feel a bit repetitive. That being said, there were some valuable things here. So the author talked about counter poses, so if we go into like a big forward bend, that we should do some level of extension afterwards, but that we don't have to mimic the duration or depth. We just have to get some sort of counter to it. And also there was some sort of like aphorism here around if we strengthen something we should do a little bit of stretching, and if we stretch something we should do a little bit of strengthening. Just the basic sort of principles around countering. There was a lot of investigation into the spine and talking about the different types of load. The one I'll focus on here is shear, which is basically two different directional forces. So say if one's going forward and one's going backwards, that's what causes spondy, at least that's what I've heard. So what the author was saying is that if we want to try and counter shear, we can add compression in, and we can do that by trying to get tensed muscles around that area. So interestingly, like onto that point, if we want to stabilize the SI joints, which I induced laxity in a few years ago by overstretching, basically we can tense the thoracolumbar fascia. This area is just basically like lower to mid back fascia. If we actually look at it from the anatomy training's perspective, which is the previous book I was reading, really this is just like the universal fascia that covers the body, just in the back section. If we're tensing this fascia, we'll stabilize the SI joint. Also, if we tense a few of these other muscles that don't directly tie into the SI joint but tie into the fascia, we'll stabilize the joint. Like a good example of this would be like if I activate the lat, apparently it'll stabilize the contralateral, so the opposite side SI joint, which is definitely something that I've noticed when I do bird dogs. Like it's important that the leg that's not moving has like a really good base through the arm. Otherwise, you won't get the same kind of wonderful sensation of stability through that side and that SI joint. One thing I thought would be very applicable to poses generally was I was talking about the anterior superior iliac spine or the posterior superior iliac spine, basically just the notches at the front and back of your hip bones. Basically, they're saying oftentimes yoga teachers use those as a way of determining if your pelvis is uneven, and author is basically saying here like that's actually just not a valid way of doing it or a reliable way of doing it. There's often just different asymmetries in your body, like different heights of your hip bones, that this isn't really a good way of determining it at all. You could actually start inducing like posterior or anterior tilt or lateral tilts by trying to even them, when really you should just be trying to get that sense of neutral. Beyond that, I just want to touch on the pelvic floor a bit. This is something that I really investigated a fair bit at a time and then kind of abandoned. This was because I found I was able to brace without focusing on it. But I also had done a fair bit of pelvic floor work previously, so I'm not sure I sort of developed some level of unconscious control of it. But the author is saying here there's some yogic strategies around the pelvic floor. I will add that this covered the anatomy better than most things that I've seen for the pelvic floor. When I tried to like memorize anatomy, pelvic floor is one of the things I essentially left out because there was so much contradictory information around what that area was, or super vague info. So this seemed good for that. But they were saying that there's a few different ways to pull up on the pelvic floor. So essentially from the front, directly up, or sort of from the back. Which was cool to see. It could potentially be isolated, but they said in most people when they start, it's all going to come up as one. The other thing they said is that if you have any laxity in the pubic symphysis, which is just this little thing at the front of your hip bone that sort of joins them, it's rare, but if you do have it, pelvic floor work, because it attaches to that symphysis, can help stabilize things. I don't think that's the case for me, but good to know. I'm glad that's an option. And yeah, I'm not sure if I'm going to keep reading this book much longer, to be honest. I'm going to give it a bit of a go, but I am really interested in trying some of these stretches to follow on from that anatomy trains work around the plasticity of fascia. I really want to lean into that if I can. So might try and find something in that space. Otherwise, I don't know, might try and look at like ultimate back health and fitness from McGill or something like that. But yeah, that's day 8. Glad to be in week 2. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.